Well, welcome everyone. Thanks for joining us. If you're returning, thanks for joining us again. This is our second webinar about our No Heat project. Today we're going to be talking about tools for identifying the hottest street segments in your own community. So my name is Seth Stromwasser. I'm a data analyst at the Boston Region Metropolitan Planning Organization, and I'm joined by Dr. Ronak Basu. Ronak, would you like to introduce yourself?
Sure. Hello, everyone. Good afternoon. My name is Ronak Basu. I am an assistant professor in the School of City and Regional Planning at Georgia Tech in Atlanta, and I used to work at the Boston Region MPO before my current position.
Great. Thank you, Ronak. And we'll go ahead and get started. So here's a quick overview of what we're going to cover today. We'll review what we presented in our first webinar from a couple weeks ago. And if you weren't able to make it to that, the link to the recording is on our YouTube channel, and we'll share it here and in an email if you want to go back and take a look at that. Then we'll go into more detail about our heat risk analysis that we completed as part of this project. We're going to talk about the input data, the methodology, and how you can approach similar projects, whether your study area is in the Boston metropolitan region or outside of it. So first, an introduction to the MPO and the project. The Boston Region Metropolitan Planning Organization, or MPO, is a regional public agency covering the 97 cities and towns in and around Boston. We not only study transportation issues, we also provide millions of dollars in federal funding for transportation projects. So in the summer of 2024, we launched a project called Neutralizing Onerous Heat Effects on Active Transportation, also known as No Heat. And there are four main elements to this project. Last summer, we completed development of high-resolution microclimate data and conducted a risk analysis on heat stress for people walking and biking. That process gave us a list of high-risk locations to focus on, which we then brought to our municipal and community partners for feedback. Through walk and bike audits and other engagement events, we worked with the community to decide where to install low-cost, quick-build heat mitigation structures as pilot interventions across the region. And we're continuing to conduct public engagement to gather feedback on these pilots and hear about people's experience with heat when they're moving around outside. And as I just mentioned, cross-sector collaboration is really a key element of this project. We partnered with researchers at Georgia Tech, the municipalities of Chelsea, Everett, Revere, and Framingham, and community-based organizations like Walk Massachusetts, Mass Bike, Bike to the Sea, and the Mystic River Watershed Association. And we received a municipal vulnerability preparedness grant from the state's Executive Office of Energy and Environmental Affairs to complete this work. So we talked last time about the idea of perceived distance, where two trips of the same length can feel like they are longer or shorter than they actually are. And so this graphic illustrates a situation where we have two sidewalks of the same length, but due to the conditions of the sidewalk and the roadway, the person on the bottom will feel like this trip is longer. They've got to go over this rough sidewalk. There's lots of cars going by, exposed to a lot of heat. And so this is important for us to think about when it comes to active transportation. People walking and biking are going to be affected by the perceived distance of their trips. And like I said, one factor that we know plays a big role in this is heat. And so to quantify how heat is experienced by people walking, biking, and rolling throughout the region, we turned to the Universal Thermal Climate Index, or UTCI. UTCI is a model that takes into account the way the human body experiences heat. Data on air temperature, humidity, wind speed, and radiant temperature are merged with assumptions about how people's metabolism and clothing affect how they process heat to produce a perceived temperature, that is the UTCI. And the UTCI can be translated into categories of heat stress that show where heat stress becomes harmful to human health. So according to the model, UTCI values as low as 78 degrees Fahrenheit can be a threat to human health. And this is especially true for vulnerable groups like young children or older adults. And then a quick note on when we should use UTCI. UTCI is a metric that should be used for human-centric applications. So things like heat risk, heat exposure for people. It's not appropriate for looking at the impact of heat on infrastructure or wildlife or vegetation, other applications that don't involve humans. And we should also note that the data is not available for buildings or water bodies. Metrics like land surface temperature are more suited for these purposes when you're trying to compare different land cover categories. And so, as I said earlier, our goal in this project was to be able to identify the highest risk locations for people walking and biking. And in order to identify the hottest corridors, we needed UTCI at the link level. So here's a look at how we got to the link level data for the entire region. UTCI is first produced as a raster data set, which is essentially a grid with a value in every 1 square meter cell. This example shows the UTCI at 1 p.m. on a typical summer day centered on downtown Boston. And so we overlaid this data with the road network and calculated the mean UTCI along each road segment. This gives us a data set that allows us to highlight the hottest corridors in the region or within particular municipalities. And as you can see here, there's heat stress on most of the network on a hot day. But where there are tall buildings or lots of trees, you can see that the heat stress is lower. And I'll just quickly give an overview of the heat risk analysis that we did, which Dr. Basu will be going into more detail about. So since this project focused on people walking and biking, we wanted to go beyond just looking at the hottest locations, which we can see with the UTCI data. We combined these data with modeled pedestrian and bicycle activity from a data fusion platform called Replica to produce a measure of heat risk that can tell us where both the heat stress is high and there are a lot of people moving around outside. And we used this heat risk data to identify priority locations, first at the regional level and then at the municipal level for our 4 partner municipalities. This analysis helped us produce a list of high-risk locations, which, as you'll see later on, we used to identify priority corridors for heat mitigation. And so now I'll talk a little bit about the data that we use to calculate the UTCI. And so for anyone looking to produce this data for an area outside of the Boston metro region, you'll need to think about where you can get these data sets. Some of them are available globally or nationally, but not all. And we're more than happy to help navigate that. And we'll talk about that a little bit more later too. So first up is meteorological data. We got this from the European Center for Medium Range Weather Forecasts, ECMWF, their reanalysis. And these data are available for free and across the entire globe. This data has a pretty coarse resolution. It's around a quarter of a degree grid cell, which is several miles, but it does have an hourly temporal resolution, and that allows us to look at different times of the day, which is very important because obviously we know heat varies a lot throughout the day. So we downloaded the temperature, humidity, solar radiation, and wind speed, and we did that for 2 scenarios: a typical summer day, which we chose based on where the heat index was close to the average for the summer, and an extremely hot summer day, so the hottest summer day. So up next is data relating to 3D modeling, which is a crucial aspect of the UTCI model. The basis for these data sets is LiDAR data, which is collected by bouncing signals off a surface and using those signals to determine the height of objects. Obviously, it's much more complicated than that, but I won't get into the details. This produces a LiDAR point cloud, which is a huge data set that's got millions of points. They're classified as ground, vegetation, or buildings, among lots of other categories. And the USGS has produced a lot of these data across the country. In Massachusetts, we have a subset of these data from 2021 that is available through MassGIS. And I think the main part of it is for Eastern Massachusetts. So if you're outside of that area, this is something that you may have to find a different source for. And the LiDAR data is used to create 2 important inputs to the UTCI model: a digital elevation model and a digital surface model. You can see in the diagram here, DSM is digital surface model, DEM, digital elevation model, or digital terrain model. Um, the digital elevation model represents the height of the ground without objects like trees and buildings, while the digital surface model includes those objects like trees and buildings. The DSM allows us to model shade and wind flow, which are very important factors in thermal comfort. And a note here that the model does require separate digital surface models for both trees and buildings, since they're treated differently in the model. Next, we've got building footprints. These we got from Overture Maps, which is a free and open source data set that comes from a collection of providers. The data is updated monthly. It's available globally. And the buildings do have a height attribute, which we need to calculate UTCI, but it's not always reliable and it's not comprehensive. So we had to do some processing to fill in those gaps. Next, we've got land cover, and this is a very important part of the model because it lets us incorporate the different thermal properties of surfaces. For example, bare ground, grass, water. We know that heat reflecting off of or being emitted by those surfaces is very different. So we got these data from NOAA, which has produced 1 meter resolution data sets in most of the coastal areas of the country, I believe. The data that we used are from 2016, but I believe that they're in the process of producing a more up-to-date version. There are some alternative data sources here, but for us, the resolution was not high enough for our purposes. We were really trying to get at that 1 meter resolution for the final product. And I note here too that the data did need to be reclassified to match the schema used in the model. So we had to sort of condense some of the categories in the NOAA data. And then lastly, we have our mobility data. So as I said, this was used to generate a measure of heat risk based on where we know there is heat and a lot of walking and biking activity. So this isn't an input to the UTCI model, but we did use it to calculate our heat risk. We used estimated summer 2023 volumes from Replica, which I mentioned earlier, that data fusion provider. And we had to do a little bit of processing here because Replica does not provide link level data for the summer, only for the fall and the spring. And so we had to scale that fall data to sort of match levels for the summer. We're happy to go into more detail about that if folks are interested, if you have questions. Um, and then importantly to note about this data is that it is proprietary. So you will need access to it. We're happy to help folks figure that out. If they're interested, I believe that MassDOT can provide access to municipalities in the Commonwealth using their license. But I'll also say that we use this data because these are the best that we can get for regional coverage of walking and biking activity on each link. But if folks have other mobility data, say for just one municipality or even for just a few corridors, those data can also be used to calculate heat risk as long as it covers the locations that you're interested in. And again, we're happy to help folks with this process, so please reach out. We'll talk about our contact info and ways that you can solicit our help at the end here. And now I'll just turn it over to Dr. Basu, who's going to talk more about the development of our heat risk data.
Thank you, Seth. So let's dive a little deeper into how we combine these different input data sets to look at heat risk and identify priority corridors. Next slide, please. So the first step was, of course, to model the UTCI, and this is the graphic that Seth had shown earlier. So we have these different input data sets that are combined to generate the UTCI, which is a measure of perceived thermal comfort. So the air temperature and relative humidity can be obtained directly from the ERA 5 data set, but then we do have to go through a couple of models to obtain the mean radiant temperature and the wind speed. So we'll look into those workflows in a bit more detail. Next slide, please. So the first one we'll look at is mean radiant temperature. So mean radiant temperature requires us to look at what is in the urban area, both in terms of the built environment as well as natural environment. So we need to account for land cover, buildings, trees, and their heights as well. Next slide, please. So we used a model called Solveig to estimate the mean radiant temperature, and there are four major primary inputs. So the LiDAR point cloud, as Seth mentioned, which helps us obtain the DEM digital elevation model and the digital surface model separately for building and ground. We also have the meteorological data that comes from ERA5, the land cover, which comes from the NOAA CCAP data set. And all of these are combined in different ways over here. As you can see, there are some intermediate data sets that need to be generated in terms of the land cover, as well as estimating the sky view factor. So how much of the open sky can be seen from different locations that would determine the amount of radiation coming in from the sun and how that radiation bounces off of different surfaces in an urban environment. So all of these are combined within the Solveig model to help us estimate the mean radiant temperature. Next slide, please. And then we have a separate model called UROC, which is used to estimate the wind speed. So we have, next slide, please. So we have a simulation that helps us determine how wind would flow at the height of a person standing on the ground. So this is relevant for pedestrians. This model is called UROC. So what we do is we look at the locations of different buildings and trees that we obtain from the DSMs, as well as their heights. So we need to know where these obstacles are, so to speak, for the wind. So we have the vegetation polygons and the building footprints, and we know their heights. And then this CFD model, computational fluid dynamics model, helps us simulate how the wind might flow around these obstacles in an urban environment. Next slide, please. So then we have the outputs from Solveig. The primary output is the mean radiant temperature, and then we also have the air temperature and relative humidity. And then we have the output from UROC, which is the pedestrian level wind field. And these four inputs are fed into a calculation which would give us the UTCI. So that's an equation. It's based off of a model, but there isn't a simulation aspect to this. Next slide, please. And then in addition to the UTCI, we also need to look at the active mobility demand. So we are showing here walking and biking volumes across Metro Boston at 5 p.m. If you recall from our first webinar, we did this analysis for three times of the day. So we were looking at three peak periods, once in the morning, 9 to 10 a.m., then once in the afternoon, between 12 and 1, and then later on in the evening between 5 and 6. Next slide, please. So what we want to do when we want to identify the high risk locations or corridors is first we zoom into a particular community or study area, right? So here we are showing Chelsea, but you could do this for any other community that you're interested in. We've done this for the entire Metro Boston region, which has 97 cities and towns. You could also create your own study area that combines multiple communities, right? So you could look at the entire inner core of the Metro Boston region, for example. So here we zoom into Chelsea, and on the left, you see the link level UTCI data in its original form. So the scale is different from what we would expect if we were to do what is known as a min-max normalization. So we scale the data from its original scale, where the minimum here is 10 degrees Celsius, going all the way up to 50 degrees Celsius. So we scale that between 0 and 1, which helps us better identify the minimum and maximum values within that particular community or study area. And the reason we do this is because we want to find the locations that have the highest UTCI within that study area. So we can combine this later on with the active mobility demand as well. Next slide, please. So we do the same thing with the active mobility demand. We have different data sets for walking and biking. This is just an example that we're showing here. And again, we have link level estimates of how many people are walking or biking at different times of the day. So we want to scale that between 0 and 1 as well, using that same min-max normalization approach. Next slide, please. So now that we have these two data sets scaled between 0 and 1, so the UTCI and the active mobility demand, we can look at walking and biking separately. So when these two are combined, we then obtain heat risk, which again is scaled between 0 and 1. And this final data set, this heat risk data set, as we can see over here, helps us identify locations that show up as higher heat risk. And those are the locations we want to zoom into in order to identify these priority corridors. Next slide, please. So that's what we do. So on the left, you have the heat risk data set scaled between 0 and 1, again at the link level. And what we want to keep in mind is that the analysis may lead to the identification of certain links as high risk, which may not always be continuous, right? So this is where some subjectivity comes in. We want to consult with local planners and community members in determining the priority corridor. So that's what we did with all of our 4 partner municipalities, where we did walk and bike audits on the ground to validate what we saw from the heat risk analysis. And then we sketched out these priority corridors for potential heat mitigation interventions. Next slide, please. And as I mentioned, we can do this separately for walking and biking, and we do see different priority corridors emerging out of the heat risk analysis, primarily because the active mobility demand data sets are different, right? So the UTCI is not going to change depending on the mode of transportation, but then the demand data sets are different, which would lead to different locations being identified as high risk, and thereby different priority corridors emerging depending on the mode of transportation. Next slide, please. So if you wanted to do similar analysis for a community or communities within the Boston MPO region, so we do have UTCI data available for a couple of scenarios, as Seth mentioned. The first is a typical summer day, and then we have an extremely hot summer day, which is kind of an extreme scenario for us to consider if we really wanted to look at a worst case scenario sort of planning perspective. And we have active mobility demand available separately for walking and biking. And we can, for walking in particular, separately look at transit connections. So walking to and from transit. So the first class mile connections compared to walking for other trip purposes. We can do that for biking. And that's a facet of the data that Replica provides. So if you're interested in doing similar analysis for a community inside the Boston MPO region, MPO staff can help support that for not just one community, but also a sub-region, as I mentioned, to identify priority corridors. Next slide, please. And if you're interested in doing this for communities outside of the MPO region, you'll need to generate the UTCI because that is something we have not done yet. You can follow our modeling workflow. We have a link later on that points you to the GitHub repository where all the code is available open source. And the active mobility demand, which comes from Replica, is available for the state of Massachusetts. Replica does provide that data nationally, but that depends on whether you might have access to that through a subscription, either through your organization or a partner organization. I do want to emphasize something that Seth highlighted earlier. We don't have to depend on one particular data set, right? So the idea here is to understand where people are walking and biking. So getting an estimate of actual travel patterns for active mobility. So if you have an alternative data source that would serve in just an appropriate manner. So if you have pet bike count data that you're confident about, if you have LBS data, location-based service data from a source other than Replica, those could certainly be used as alternatives as well. And when you go through that heat risk analysis, you can follow our approach of scaling and then combining the UTCI and active mobility demand, and you should be able to replicate this. Now, several of the input data sources that Seth mentioned earlier are available only particularly for the US. My research group at Georgia Tech we've been doing this for several cities within the US, outside of Massachusetts as well. So we can point you to appropriate data sources in other states. We have not done this for any country outside the US. So we'll need to explore appropriate data sets if we wanted to model the UTCI for other countries. Next slide, please. So we have a bunch of resources for you to explore. I'll pass it back to Seth to walk us through all of these resources.
Great, thank you, Ronak. So yeah, as I mentioned a few times, we're really eager to talk to you about ideas that you have, help that you need, um, and get you connected to these resources that we have. So please feel free to reach out to us at this email, noheat@ctps.org. I can also put my email, and Rona can put his email in the chat as well. And we'll have these links. Yeah, there we go. The links are in the chat. And I'll also send a follow-up email with these links as well. So we also have this Google form here, which is a link to download the UTCI data that we've produced. We have we have the UTCI as rasters and at the link level, like I discussed, and we are happy to provide that. And again, if there are questions about using it, please do reach out. We'd be happy to help sort of get you set up and get going on your project. Ronak mentioned this GitHub repository. This includes all of the code that we used in this project. And we're hoping this could be a resource that folks can use, like Ronak mentioned, to produce UTCI data in other places. Yeah, again, please reach out with questions about that. We will have detailed documentation about the code in there released soon. It's not quite ready to go, but we will send that out when it's available. We also have our UTCI Data Explorer. This is a web application that's got a map in it. You can look around and see what this UTCI data looks like, both as rasters and as links or segments for the Boston region. It doesn't allow you to access the data values themselves, but it's a good tool for sort of visualizing and seeing the level of detail that's available. The MPO has a technical assistance program, which is run by our manager of multimodal planning and design, Jen Concanon. So we encourage folks to reach out to us through that program and take advantage of that. We're always eager to work with municipalities to help them apply this data and these ideas to their work. And then lastly, we have a link to the first webinar, which I mentioned, which I hope you'll take a look at, and we will similarly release a link to this recording after it's done. So with that, that is our show. We have plenty of time for questions and discussion. We would love to hear from you, any points of clarification or ideas you have. So please feel free to speak up or put a question in the chat. All right, we've got a question here. Do we offer support for Lawrence, Massachusetts? That is a good question. I think that may be outside of our region. Um, if anybody in here could confirm that, I believe that that's outside of the Boston region MPO. But again, we're happy to meet with you, talk about your data needs, how we can work together. Chad Fisher asks, are there plans to generate this data regularly, every 3 years perhaps? Good question. We have talked about that, and we haven't quite settled on an answer, I think. We, a lot of the data that goes into the UTCI does not change very much. But, in a place like Massachusetts, there's lots of development. new buildings, new trees getting planted, things like that. So I think there is an appetite to show some change over time, whether it be 3 years or 5 years. And there's also, a lot of these data sets are somewhat old, 2016 or 2021 as new data comes out. I think it'd be interesting to look at that. We are doing some work right now, sort of modeling hypothetical scenarios with the UTCI, and that's mostly focused on sort of potential heat mitigation. So, planting trees along a corridor or installing shade structures, modeling that in the data, and then looking to see how that affects the UTCI. So I think we're hopefully there will be, updates to this data in the future. Um, but right now we haven't committed to um, any schedule on that. Uh, Rob Raymond asks, is there a toolkit for how to correct heat issues, as in adding trees might have this much positive impact? Um, something to show the benefits of changing surroundings. That is a good question. I don't think we have anything that is mainly focused at that, although I do think that we have done a lot of work to sort of explore the different mitigation structures. In this project, we're really focused on sort of quick build, low cost things. So we've put in some shaded picnic benches. We have planted some trees. But I think that, yeah, there's definitely been questions about, these sort of resources. Rebecca, I don't know if you have anything to add to that.
Yeah, thanks, Seth. We are looking at doing just that. And part of what we're doing now with the current project that we have is trying to assess the interventions that we implemented for this project, what kind of impact that has. And we're looking to expand that more as like a communication tool to say, okay, if we were to have a stretch of trees along this corridor, if we were to put multiple shelters at these type of locations, what kind of impact may that have? How might that reduce heat stress? So that's something that we're testing at kind of more of a pilot scale right now, but certainly have plans to expand that in the coming years.
Thanks, Rebecca. Diane asks, have you looked at future temperature projections to identify areas for anticipated future prioritization or investment? That is a good question. No, we have not. I think, yeah, that's certainly a path we could go down. I think, it's interesting looking at comparing the data between sort of a typical day in an extreme day. The patterns are similar, but there are differences as you increase the temperature, humidity, things like that. Ronak, did you have something to add?
Yes, I wanted to add that with the future temperature projections, they typically only consider air temperature, and we don't get to see the spatial variation, right? So these projections would be something along the lines of, well, the average heat index or the average air temperature is going to increase by 3 degrees Celsius or 4 degrees Celsius over the next 30 to 50 years, but we don't get to see the spatial variation. We also don't have a good estimate of how land cover is going to change, right? The UTCI is a very hyper local estimate of perceived thermal comfort. So, unless we have good projections for all of our input data sets, by just updating the air temperature projection, we wouldn't really be doing a good job of estimating the future UTCI.
Great, thank you, Ronak. Um, Chad Fisher asks, are you all using DCR's Project Shade Kit? Or what reference do we use for shade structure/interventions? Good question. I think I might turn that to Rebecca if you have an answer there.
I can speak to this. Yeah, we didn't use DCR's Project Shade Kit specifically, but we did work with DCR in Everett and Chelsea and for some of the tree planting that happened at those locations. Um, the focus of the interventions was really around the community engagement and wanting to understand from people within the community what type of interventions might make sense for where they live or their neighborhood. So we that was the starting point of the types of interventions they were interested in. And I see Carmen is showing up here, so she can speak a bit more to this as well. But there was research that was done around what type of interventions might make sense given what the community's interest was. And then we had certain options that were available to us through some contract mechanisms. But I'll pass it over to Carmen for more details on that.
Technology is rebelling. Okay, Carmen's going to respond in chat. Thank you. We still have plenty of time for other questions. Any thoughts? Please feel free to unmute yourself or throw something in the chat. Yes, Rob, please go ahead.
Yeah, I'm just wondering if there's any kind of also applicability kind of going the other way with cold weather. Just thinking about kind of walking through the city in the winter or something like that. When that wind whips down the street, it gets pretty brutal.
Yes, great question. The UTCI does go in both directions. There is, yeah, there are categories for cold stress. And yeah, it was funny when we were working on a lot of this project. It was during the winter, and it was hard for us to sort of envision heat stress at that time. And we were all wondering, could we look at the cold stress? And yeah, that is absolutely a possibility. I think that would be really interesting to see, because yeah, as you said, the built environment does have a big impact on things like wind tunnels. So yeah, that would be a very interesting thing to try out. I'll just read Carmen's response here. We didn't work directly with DCR with the DCR kit. The shade structures we chose and ultimately installed overlap pretty closely with that kit. Two of the structures were solar shelters, a shaded picnic table and a shaded bench. And we also installed other non-solar shaded benches in one of the other municipalities. Thanks, Carmen. Any other questions, thoughts, ideas? Yeah, Carmen mentions that in some of the locations, having something that didn't require excavation was important due to site constraints. So these freestanding solar structures were a good option. Yeah, I think that was an interesting part of the project too, was sort of learning what these quick build interventions require, and some sort of the limitations around them. But still, it was, I mean, the, I don't want to speak for our municipal partners, but we've heard that they were, very grateful and impressed with the speed and ease that we were able to, get things in the ground. So, Sheila asks if we have any pictures of a freestanding solar structure. We do. I don't know if somebody wants to try and pull one of those up.
I can pull some. I think now also my my audio is working. But yeah,
Excellent.
I can pull some and put them in the chat.
All right. Any other questions while Carmen is pulling those up? All right, not seeing any other questions. Rebecca or Ronak, any last thoughts you want to add before we wrap up?
Not on my end.
I
I
can
think
say
I,
that
oh,
we're
sorry.
we're we're be very happy to have further conversations. We're seeing this as kind of a starting point to try to get the data out there and the methodology out there. But if there's further questions that come up, please do reach out to us. We'd be happy to have some additional conversations.
I was just going to say, I think it's
Yes.
not possible to attach photos in the Zoom chat, but we can maybe send those along as an attachment to the follow-up email.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah, I was gonna say we will, yeah, send out an email with all of these links and the slides, and yeah, we'll include some pictures in there. Thank you all for joining us. Again, please reach out with anything. We'll send out that email shortly, and I hope you all have a good rest of your day and week. Stay cool.
Thank you.